A group of children playing are startled when a mother fox and her cubs appear. The surprising response from the kids creates an unforgettable moment. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maplewood's community playground. Ruby, a wild fox with distinctive russet fur and alert ears, stood partially concealed behind an old maple tree. Her muscles remained tense, ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. From her vantage point, she could observe the entire playground while keeping her two young cubs, Max and Lily, safely hidden behind her. The playground buzzed with the typical sounds of children playing: the creak of swing chains, the hollow thump of feet on wooden platforms, and the persistent hum of young voices. These sounds had drawn Ruby's attention during her daily hunting routine. While most wild foxes would avoid such noise, something about these particular sounds sparked her curiosity. Max and Lily fidgeted behind their mother, their small bodies trembling with excitement. Max, the more adventurous of the two, kept trying to peek around Ruby's legs, while Lily pressed herself against her mother's warm fur, equally curious but more cautious. Their black-tipped ears twitched at every new sound, and their whiskers quivered as they caught the unfamiliar scents of the playground. Among the children of the playground, Jake and Emma stood out. The siblings had just arrived after school, their backpacks still slung over their shoulders. Jake, the older of the two, was the first to notice the fox family. He grabbed his sister's sleeve, putting a finger to his lips before pointing toward the tree line. Emma's eyes widened as she spotted Ruby's distinctive silhouette against the darkening shadows. The children had never seen a fox so close to the playground before. Most wild animals avoided this area, especially during the busy after-school hours. Jake, who had recently completed a school project on local wildlife, recognized this as an unusual opportunity. He squeezed Emma's hand, silently communicating the need to move slowly and carefully. The siblings began their cautious approach, taking small, measured steps. They moved diagonally, not heading straight for the foxes, which might have appeared threatening. Jake remembered reading that direct approaches could frighten wild animals. Emma followed his lead, though her excitement made it difficult to maintain the slow pace. Ruby's ears flattened slightly as she noticed the children's movement, but she didn't immediately retreat. Her natural instincts urged her to flee with her cubs, but something about these young humans' careful approach gave her pause. Perhaps it was their size, closer to her own than adult humans, or maybe it was their gentle movements that didn't trigger her danger responses. Max and Lily's reactions complicated Ruby's decision-making. While she would normally have led them away from human contact, their curious whimpers and eager movements forward made her hesitate. Max had already taken several small steps toward the approaching children, his natural caution warring with his innate curiosity. Lily, though still pressing against Ruby's fur, had stopped trembling and was watching the children with increasing interest. The distance between the two groups gradually decreased. Jake and Emma moved slowly enough that their approach took several minutes, giving Ruby plenty of time to assess the situation. They stopped every few steps, kneeling down to appear less threatening. The playground sounds continued in the background, creating a familiar backdrop that somehow made the scene feel less dangerous to Ruby. As Jake and Emma got closer, they slowly lowered themselves to sit cross-legged on the ground. This final gesture seemed to ease Ruby's remaining tension. She remained alert, but allowed her cubs to peek out more. Penley. The first real connection was forming, though none of the participants yet realized how significant this moment would become. The children's faces broke into gentle smiles, not the wide grins that might have showed teeth and frightened the foxes, but soft expressions of wonder and friendship. In this moment, two very different worlds began to intersect, though the full implications of this meeting remained unknown to all involved. Jake slowly reached into his backpack, his movements deliberately measured to avoid startling Ruby and her cubs. He retrieved a small paper bag containing his untouched afternoon snack. Emma watched intently as her brother carefully extracted a few pieces of his sandwich, breaking them into smaller, manageable portions. The sound of the paper crinkling made Max's ears perk up with interest, while Lily remained partially hidden behind her mother. The offering of food marked a critical moment in their budding relationship. Jake placed a small piece of sandwich on the ground and scooted backward, creating space between himself and the food. Ruby's nose twitched as she caught the scent of the bread and turkey. Her wild instincts made her hesitate. Accepting food from humans went against everything she knew, everything that had kept her and her cubs safe until now. Max, however, showed no such reservation. The young cub took a tentative step forward, his nose working overtime to process the new smell. Ruby made a soft warning sound, but her son's curiosity had already gotten the better of him. Emma held her breath as the small fox approached the food, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep from reaching out to touch the approaching cub. The first bite was quick. Max darted forward, snatched the morsel, and retreated to his mother's side. This successful venture seemed to break some invisible barrier. Lily, seeing her brother safely sample the offering, began to edge forward as well. Jake carefully placed another piece on the ground, this time slightly closer to where he and Emma sat. Ruby watched her cubs carefully as they grew bolder with each successful approach to the food. Her own hunger and curiosity began to override her caution. When Jake placed a third piece of sandwich on the ground, Ruby herself took a few steps forward. The children remained perfectly still as the adult fox approached, understanding that this moment of trust was fragile and precious. Emma, inspired by the positive interaction, whispered to Jake about introducing play into their encounter. She remembered reading that young animals, like puppies and kittens, learn about their world through play. The challenge was finding a way to initiate such interaction without frightening their new friends. The young girl slowly reached in her own backpack and withdrew a soft red ball, one she often used during recess. She placed it on the ground and gave it a gentle push, sending it rolling in the direction of the fox family. The ball moved slowly enough not to startle them, but caught the attention of both cubs immediately. Max and Lily watched the ball with fascination, their heads tilting in unison as it rolled to a stop nearby. To everyone's surprise, Max darted forward and nudged the ball with his nose, sending it rolling back toward the children. Emma's face lit up with delight, though she managed to contain her excitement to avoid startling their new friends. This simple exchange marked the beginning of something extraordinary. Ruby, seeing her cubs engage safely with the children, began to relax her vigilant stance. Her tail, which had been held stiffly, started to show signs of ease. She settled into a sitting position, maintaining her watchful presence, but no longer poised for immediate flight. The playground's ambient noise seemed to fade into the background as this small group formed their own private world of discovery and connection. Other children continued their play on the equipment, unaware of the remarkable scene unfolding at the edge of the playground. The afternoon light softened, casting a golden glow over the unlikely gathering. What had started as a cautious encounter was transforming into something more meaningful. Ruby observed as her cubs, especially Max, grew more confident in their interactions with the children. Lily, though still shy, had moved completely out from behind her mother and was showing increasing interest in the gentle game developing before them. From her bench near the playground's edge, Mrs. Henderson, Jake and Emma's grandmother, had been observing the extraordinary scene unfold. Her weathered hands rested on her wooden cane, and her eyes sparkled with recognition of something she hadn't seen in decades. The sight of her grandchildren carefully interacting with the wild foxes transported her back to her own childhood in rural Vermont. With the wisdom that comes from years of observing both nature and human behavior, Mrs. Henderson decided it was time to add her presence to this delicate situation. She slowly rose from her bench, her movements careful and deliberate. In one hand, she carried a woven basket she had brought for their afternoon snack, filled with fresh apples and berries from her garden. As she approached, she began humming softly, an old folk tune she remembered from her childhood. The gentle melody served two purposes. It announced her presence without startling the foxes and created a soothing atmosphere. Ruby's ears twitched at the new sound, but the calm demeanor of Jake and Emma toward their grandmother helped maintain the peaceful environment. Mrs. Henderson stopped several feet from the group, lowering herself carefully to sit on a nearby log. Her joints creaked slightly, but her movements remained smooth and unthreatening. She placed her basket beside her and began to speak in a low, gentle voice, sharing stories from her youth with both the children and their wild visitors. "When I was just about your age, Emma," she began, her voice carrying the warmth of memory, "we had a family of foxes living near our farm. Every spring, they would bring their kids to the edge of our property." As she spoke, she carefully selected a ripe blackberry from her basket and placed it on the ground between the groups. The story continued as Max cautiously approached the new offering. Mrs. Henderson described how her father had taught her to respect wildlife while maintaining a safe distance. She explained how the farm's foxes had actually helped them by controlling the rodent population that threatened their crops. Her words created a bridge between past and present, between human and wild. Lily, usually the more timid of the cubs, seemed particularly drawn to the grandmother's gentle presence. Perhaps it was the soothing quality of her voice, or maybe the young fox sensed the wisdom and kindness emanating from the elderly woman. Whatever the reason, Lily gradually moved closer to listen to the stories, her fear seemingly forgotten. As Mrs. Henderson continued sharing her memories, she carefully distributed more fruits from her basket. She explained to Jake and Emma how wild animals could safely eat certain fruits and which ones to avoid offering. Her knowledge, accumulated over decades of observing nature, turned the moment into an impromptu lesson about wildlife conservation and respect. Ruby, still maintaining her protective watch, appeared to relax even further in the presence of the grandmother. There was something about Mrs. Henderson's energy that seemed to resonate with the wild fox's own maternal instincts. The woman's careful movements and gentle voice created an atmosphere of safety and trust. The late afternoon light filtered through the trees, creating dappled patterns on the ground between them. Mrs. Henderson's stories flowed naturally, weaving together tales of wildlife encounters with lessons about patience, respect, and the delicate balance between human civilization and the natural world. Jake and Emma listened intently, absorbing both their grandmother's stories and the magic of the moment. They had never seen this side of their grandmother before. This connection to nature and wildlife that went beyond her usual garden tending and bird feeding. Her presence had transformed their exciting encounter into something deeper, more meaningful. The peaceful scene at the playground seemed almost magical, Ruby and her cubs interacting with the children, while Mrs. Henderson shared her wisdom. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm, golden hues, and the natural barriers between wild and domestic had temporarily dissolved into a moment of pure harmony. Ruby watched her cubs with visible contentment as they explored this new, safe space with their human companions. Max had grown particularly bold, now comfortable enough to take treats directly from the ground near Jake's feet. Lily, though still more reserved, had settled into a spot equidistant between her mother and Mrs. Henderson, her eyes bright with interest as she listened to the grandmother's gentle voice. The transformation in Ruby's typically cautious cubs filled her with a mix of pride and something approaching happiness. The playground's regular sounds had become a familiar backdrop to their interaction. The distant squeaks of swings, the muffled voices of other children, the rustle of leaves in the light breeze. Ruby had even started to associate these sounds with safety, a remarkable shift for a wild animal who normally avoided human spaces entirely. Her muscles had relaxed, and her alert posture had softened into something more casual. However, the peaceful atmosphere shattered in an instant. A new scent carried on the wind, the sharp smell of gun oil and leather, mixed with human sweat and something metallic. Ruby's body tensed immediately, her motherly instincts screaming danger before her mind could even process why. Her ears swiveled toward the source of the threat, and her nose twitched rapidly, gathering more information. Jake, who had been quietly offering another piece of fruit to Max, noticed the sudden change in Ruby's demeanor. The fox's transformation from relaxed to alert was so dramatic that it caught his attention immediately. He looked up, following Ruby's gaze toward the tree line on the far side of the playground. There, partially obscured by shadows, a figure moved with deliberate slowness. The hunter's appearance was like a discordant note in their peaceful symphony. His camouflage clothing and the distinctive shape of a rifle slung over his shoulder marked him as someone with very different intentions toward the Fox family. Jake's heart began to race as he realized the danger. He caught Emma's eye and gave a subtle shake of his head, warning her to stay still. Ruby's body had become as taut as a bowstring. Her previous trust and relaxation vanished, replaced by the wild instincts that had kept her and her cubs alive. She made a low, barely audible sound, a warning to Max and Lily. The cubs, picking up on their mother's tension, immediately moved closer to her, their playful demeanor replaced by nervous alertness. Mrs. Henderson, with decades of experience reading both animals and situations, recognized the gravity of the moment. She remained perfectly still, her weathered hands gripping her cane slightly tighter. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, tracked the hunter's movement while her mind raced through possible solutions to protect both the children and the foxes. The hunter hadn't spotted them yet, but his purposeful movement suggested he was aware of the foxes' presence in the area. Each step he took brought him closer to their hidden corner of the playground, and with each step, the tension in the air grew thicker. Ruby's muscles coiled tighter, ready to spring into action at any moment. Jake felt torn between his desire to protect their new friends and the knowledge that any sudden movement might draw unwanted. Et attention. Emma, sensing the danger but not fully understanding it, pressed closer to her brother's side. The joy and wonder of their afternoon had transformed into something more urgent and frightening. The hunter's approach changed everything in the playground's secluded corner. Ruby's maternal instincts kicked into overdrive as she positioned herself between the approaching threat and her cubs. Her russet fur bristled, making her appear larger, while her eyes never left the hunter's advancing figure. The transformation from peaceful woodland mother to protective warrior happened in mere seconds. Max and Lily, responding to their mother's signals, tried to make themselves as small as possible behind her. Gone was Max's playful confidence and Lily's growing comfort, replaced by the ingrained survival instincts of wild creatures. Their small bodies trembled, but they remained silent, understanding on some primitive level that sound would only draw attention to their location. Jake and Emma, despite their young age, recognized the need for action. Emma, her heart pounding but her mind clear, began to deliberately make noise by scuffing her feet and rustling leaves. Jake quickly caught on to his sister's strategy and joined in, creating more distinctive sounds that might alert other adults in the playground to their presence. Their movements, while seemingly random, were carefully calculated to draw attention without startling Ruby and her cubs. Mrs. Henderson rose slowly from her seat, her arthritis forgotten in the urgency of the moment. She straightened to her full height, letting her cane tap purposefully against a nearby rock. The sharp sound carried across the playground, causing the hunter to pause momentarily in his approach. Her presence added a new dimension to the scene, no longer just a grandmother sharing stories, but a formidable protector in her own right. The hunter, now aware of the human presence, adjusted his path to approach more directly. His rifle, though still slung over his shoulder, seemed more threatening with each step he took. His face showed confusion at finding people so close to his quarry, but his purpose remained clear in his steady advance. Ruby's warning growl, low and fierce, vibrated through the air. It was a sound that spoke of ancient wild things, of a mother's desperate need to protect her young. The sound caused the hunter to hesitate again, his hand unconsciously moving toward his rifle. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Mrs. Henderson, whose expression hardened with determination. Emma, scared but resolute, suddenly jumped up and began running in circles, her movements erratic but purposeful. Her actions served multiple purposes, creating a distraction, making enough noise to attract attention from other areas of the playground, and making it difficult for the hunter to focus solely on the foxes. Jake, following his sister's lead, joined her chaotic dance, adding his own voice to the growing cacophony. Mrs. Henderson seized the moment to step forward, her voice carrying the authority of years when she addressed the hunter. "These creatures are under our protection," she declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This is a place for children and families, not hunting." Her words, though calm, carried an underlying steel that made the hunter pause in his tracks. Ruby, sensing the human's defensive actions, remained rooted in her protective stance. Her cubs pressed closer to her legs, their small bodies still trembling, but their trust in their mother absolute. The fox's eyes darted between the hunter and her human defenders, her wild instincts warring with the trust she had begun to develop. The confrontation balanced on a knife's edge. The hunter's hand still hovered near his weapon, but Mrs. Henderson's presence and the children's ongoing commotion had created a situation he hadn't anticipated. The simple hunt he had planned had transformed into something far more complicated, with witnesses and moral implications he hadn't expected to face. The tension in the air had reached a breaking point. The hunter's hesitation, while promising, didn't diminish the very real threat he posed to Ruby and her cubs. His fingers drummed against the strap of his rifle, betraying his internal conflict between proceeding with his hunt and backing down in the face of unexpected opposition. The late afternoon shadows stretched longer across the playground, adding an ominous quality to the standoff. Ruby, drawing on every instinct honed through generations of survival, made her decision. With a sudden, fierce bark that echoed across the playground, she took an aggressive step forward. This wasn't the action of a frightened animal fleeing. It was a mother's declaration of war. Her teeth flashed in the fading light, and her entire body language screamed defiance rather than fear. The hunter's response was immediate but measured. He shifted his weight, squaring his shoulders as he assessed this new development. His experience with wildlife had taught him to respect an animal's defensive display, but his pride and purpose kept him from retreating. The rifle remained slung over his shoulder, but his stance suggested he could bring it to bear in seconds if needed. Jake, watching the situation escalate, felt his heart hammering in his chest. His mind raced through everything he knew about foxes, about hunters, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Emma clutched at his sleeve, her earlier bravado tempered by the realization of how dangerous the situation had become. Yet neither child backed away. Their commitment to protecting Ruby and her cubs remained unshaken. The cubs, sensing their mother's aggressive stance, pressed themselves flat against the ground behind her. Max, usually so bold, whimpered softly, while Lily maintained the absolute silence that fear had imposed upon her. Their small bodies trembled with each bark their mother issued, but they remained exactly where she had positioned them, trusting in her protection. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the tension, steady and clear despite her age. "You're frightening the children," she stated, her words carrying both accusation and warning. Her years of experience had taught her that sometimes the best defense was to shift the focus. Making this about scared children rather than cornered wildlife might appeal to the hunter's humanity. But Ruby wasn't willing to rely solely on human intervention. With another threatening bark, she lunged forward slightly, not attacking, but making it clear she was capable of doing so. The message was unmistakable. She would fight if necessary, regardless of the odds against her. The hunter's hand moved closer to his rifle, his knuckles whitening with tension. Jake, inspired by Ruby's courage and remembering something his grandmother had once told him about distractions, began to formulate a plan. His young mind worked frantically, trying to find a way to help without putting anyone, human or fox, in more danger. He squeezed Emma's hand, silently communicating that they needed to be ready to act. The hunter took a single step forward, testing the waters. Ruby's response was immediate and fierce, a series of sharp barks and a defensive display that made her appear twice her normal size. Her message was clear. Each step forward would be met with increasing resistance. The cubs huddled closer together, their small bodies pressing against each other for comfort. Time seemed to slow down as the standoff continued. The playground's usual sounds had died away, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The hunter's next move would determine everything. Whether this would end in tragedy or triumph, whether trust and courage would prevail over threat and fear. Jake's mind raced as he watched the standoff between Ruby and the hunter continue. With a sudden burst of inspiration, he remembered how easily Max had been distracted by moving objects during their earlier play. He locked eyes with Emma and, without words, began to implement their plan. His hand closed around a small stone while Emma prepared to follow his lead. The children began their coordinated effort with practiced precision born from years of sibling cooperation. Jake threw the first stone far to the left of the hunter, where it clattered noisily through a patch of dry leaves. Emma immediately followed with a series of loud claps, directing her sounds toward the same area. The sudden noise cut through the tension like a knife, drawing the hunter's attention away from Ruby and her cubs. The diversion created a moment of confusion. The hunter's head snapped toward the source of the noise, his survival instincts forcing him to assess this new potential threat. Ruby, demonstrating remarkable intelligence, recognized the opportunity in this moment of distraction. With silent efficiency, she began guiding Max and Lily backward, using her body to shield their movement from the hunter's peripheral vision. Mrs. Henderson, quickly grasping her grandchildren's strategy, added to the confusion by calling out, "Did you see that?" Her voice carried authority and urgency, directing attention even further away from the retreating foxes. Her aged hands gripped her cane tighter as she took a deliberate step toward the source of the noises, drawing the hunter's eye line with her movement. Jake and Emma continued their orchestrated chaos. They alternated throwing small stones into different areas of the surrounding brush, creating a series of mysterious rustling sounds that suggested multiple animals moving through the undergrowth. Their timing was impeccable. Each new sound started just as the previous one faded, keeping the hunter's attention divided and uncertain. Ruby seized each moment of confusion to guide her cubs further from danger. Her movements were careful and strategic, using every available cover. Max and Lily, understanding the gravity of the situation, followed their mother's lead with uncharacteristic silence. Their small paws moved soundlessly across the ground, their natural stealth enhanced by their fear and focus. The air crackled with tension as the impromptu escape plan unfolded. Emma's heart pounded as she continued creating distractions, but her hands remained steady. Jake maintained his rhythm of throws, each one carefully calculated to seem random, while actually forming a pattern that drew attention away from Ruby's chosen escape route. Mrs. Henderson's voice rose and fell in a carefully modulated pattern, asking questions about movement in the brush that forced the hunter to keep looking away from where Ruby and her cubs were actually moving. Her experience with wildlife and human nature helped her maintain just the right tone of confused concern that demanded attention without raising suspicion. The hunter's frustration became visible as he tried to track multiple sources of movement and sound. His trained eyes searched for patterns, but the children's randomized distractions defied easy analysis. His attention split between the need to maintain his focus on his original quarry and the instinct to identify these new potential targets. The success of their plan hinged on maintaining this careful balance of chaos and control. One wrong move, one moment of silence at the wrong time, could bring the hunter's attention back to Ruby and her cubs before they reached safety. The children's hearts raced as they continued their performance, knowing that lives literally depended on their ability to maintain this elaborate deception. The hunter's momentary distraction began to waver as his experienced eye started to detect patterns in the chaos. Years of tracking had taught him to distinguish between natural and artificial disruptions, and something about the synchronized nature of the disturbances triggered his suspicion. His attention began to drift back toward Ruby's last KN. Position, his body tensing as he prepared to refocus on his original target. Ruby, still guiding her cubs to safety, sensed the shift in the hunter's awareness. Her muscles coiled with renewed tension as she realized they hadn't yet reached a safe distance. Max stumbled slightly over an exposed root, causing a tiny but audible rustle in the underbrush. The sound, though barely perceptible, was enough to draw the hunter's sharp attention back to their location. The hunter's movement was swift and decisive as he turned back toward the foxes. His hand moved to his rifle with practiced efficiency, the gesture speaking of years of experience in the field. The weapon remained shouldered, but his stance shifted subtly, preparing for quick action. His eyes narrowed as they locked onto Ruby's partially concealed form among the shadows. Mrs. Henderson recognized the critical nature of this moment. Drawing upon decades of experience with both wildlife and human nature, she took a calculated risk. Taking a step forward, she deliberately positioned herself in a way that partially obscured the hunter's line of sight to Ruby and her cubs. Her movement appeared natural, almost casual, but its purpose was clear to those who understood the stakes. Jake and Emma watched in tense silence as their grandmother's intervention bought precious seconds for Ruby's family. The cubs, now barely visible in the lengthening shadows, pressed close to their mother's legs. Lily's small form trembled visibly, while Max fought his natural instinct to bolt, trusting in his mother's guidance despite his fear. Ruby, faced with this crucial moment, made a decision that demonstrated both her intelligence and her courage. Instead of continuing their retreat, which would likely draw pursuit, she turned to face the hunter directly. Her stance was neither aggressive nor submissive. Rather, it projected a quiet dignity that seemed to challenge the hunter's assumptions about his quarry. The hunter found himself momentarily startled by this unexpected behavior. His experience had taught him to expect wild animals to either flee or fight when cornered. This calm, almost regal bearing from a creature he had viewed as merely prey caused him to hesitate, his hand still resting on his rifle, but his purpose less certain. In that moment of hesitation, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The hunter's eyes met Ruby's, and for a brief instant, there was a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between hunter and hunted. In Ruby's steady gaze, he saw not just a fox protecting her young, but a fellow parent willing to risk everything for their children. Max and Lily, sensing their mother's strategy, remained perfectly still despite their fear. Their small bodies pressed against each other for comfort, but they maintained the dignified bearing their mother displayed. The family unit's unified stance created a powerful image that was difficult to dismiss as merely targets. This pivotal moment balanced on a knife's edge. The hunter's next decision would determine not just the fate of Ruby and her cubs, but also the larger question of whether understanding could triumph over instinct, whether compassion could overcome conditioning. The tension in the air reached its peak as Jake, summoning courage beyond his years, made a decision that would change everything. Taking a careful step forward, he positioned himself where the hunter could clearly see him, but remained close enough to Ruby to make his allegiance clear. His young voice, though trembling slightly, carried clearly across the space between them. "She's not just a fox, sir. She's our friend." The simple, honest declaration hung in the air, its childish innocence cutting through layers of adult complexity. Emma, inspired by her brother's bravery, moved to stand beside him. Her presence reinforced Jake's words, creating a living testament to the unlikely bond that had formed between humans and wildlife in this small corner of Maplewood. Ruby remained perfectly still, her intelligent eyes moving between Jake and the hunter. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, no longer just protective, but now somehow inclusive, as if acknowledging the children as part of her family unit. This subtle change wasn't lost on the hunter, whose expression began to show signs of internal conflict. Mrs. Henderson seized this moment of uncertainty to share her wisdom. Her voice carried the weight of years as she spoke about the delicate balance between humans and nature, about the lessons she had learned in her long life about respect and coexistence. She didn't lecture or condemn. Instead, she shared stories of her own journey from fear to understanding. Jake, encouraged by the hunter's continued hesitation, took another careful step forward. "Watch this," he said softly, then made a gentle clicking sound, one he had used earlier while playing with the cubs. Despite the tension, Max's ears perked up at the familiar signal, and his tail gave a small, involuntary wag. This simple response, this evidence of trust between wild and human, spoke volumes. The hunter's grip on his rifle loosened slightly as he observed this interaction. His eyes, trained to see animals as targets, now witnessed something entirely different. a complex web of relationships that challenged his preconceptions. The fox family before him no longer fit neatly into the category of wildlife. They had names, personalities, connections. Emma, drawing from her own well of courage, added her voice. Lily's really shy, but she loves Grandma's stories. And Max, he plays with us now. Her words painted Ruby and her cubs not as abstract wildlife, but as individuals with distinct personalities and behaviors. The hunter's expression shifted again as these simple observations forced him to see the foxes through new eyes. Ruby, seeming to understand the importance of this moment, maintained her dignified pose while allowing her cubs to peek out slightly from behind her. The family unit's dynamic, protective yet trusting, wild yet connected, created a powerful image that directly challenged the hunter's worldview. Mrs. Henderson stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm as she spoke about the responsibility of humans to protect and preserve, not just to hunt and consume. Her words carried no judgment, but rather an invitation to see the world differently, to recognize the value of life in all its forms. The confrontation had evolved into something more profound, a moment of potential transformation, where long-held beliefs collided with new understanding. The hunter found himself faced not just with a family of foxes, but with a challenge to everything he thought he knew about the relationship between humans and wildlife. The pivotal moment was unexpectedly interrupted by a sharp electronic chirp. The hunter's phone buzzed urgently in his pocket, its sudden intrusion breaking the tension that had built around them. With movements that betrayed his lingering conflict, he reached for the device, his eyes still watching the unusual group before him. The message on his screen demanded immediate attention. Alert! Aggressive bear sighted in northern sector. All hunters redirect. Immediate response required. The hunter's body language shifted as he processed this new information, professional duty warring with the profound moment he'd just experienced. Ruby sensed the change in the atmosphere, but maintained her protective stance. Her eyes, keen and intelligent, tracked every minute movement of the hunter as he processed his new orders. Max and Lily, still pressed against their mother's fur, remained remarkably still, as if understanding the delicate balance of this moment. The hunter looked up from his phone, his expression transformed by this new responsibility. His next actions would reveal whether the connection formed in these tense moments had truly changed something within him. His hands slow, Ly moved away from his rifle, a deliberate gesture that spoke volumes about his decision. Without speaking, he took several steps backward, creating distance between himself and the fox family. His movements were careful, almost respectful, no longer the stalking posture of a predator, but the considered withdrawal of someone who had glimpsed a larger truth. The urgency of his alert provided a convenient excuse, but his eyes told a different story. As the hunter turned to leave, he paused for just a moment. His gaze met Mrs. Henderson's, then moved to Jake and Emma, and finally rested on Ruby and her cubs. In that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them all, an acknowledgement of something profound that had transpired in this small corner of Maplewood. The hunter's departure was swift, but not hurried. As his figure disappeared into the lengthening shadows, the tension that had held them all in its grip began to dissipate. The playground sounds, which had seemed so distant during the confrontation, gradually filtered back into their awareness. Ruby's posture slowly relaxed, though her alertness remained. Max and Lily, sensing the danger had passed, began to emerge from behind their mother. Their small movements spoke of relief, but also of a new awareness. They had witnessed both the capacity for threat and protection in their human friends. Jake and Emma exchanged glances with their grandmother, their young faces showing the impact of what they had just experienced. Mrs. Henderson's eyes were moist with emotion as she watched Ruby gather her cubs closer, not in fear now, but in celebration of their safety and the bonds that had protected them. This experience had forged something permanent between them all, a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between wild and domestic, between human and animal. Ruby's family would return to their woodland home, but they would carry with them the knowledge of human allies who had stood beside them in their moment of need. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The unlikely group remained together for a few more precious moments. Their story would become part of Maplewood's legacy, a testament to the power of empathy, the strength of unexpected friendships, and the capacity for change that exists in every heart, human or wild. The end of their encounter marked not a goodbye, but a beginning, a new chapter in the ongoing story of how humans and wildlife could coexist, protect, and enrich each other's lives in ways both large and small.